Right, so instantly before I even properly begin this video, I want to address the thumbnail, because it is a little bit spicy. But I don't mean it in a bad way. I think the fact that I will call Venture Dive for Dummies is the exact reason why Venture is quite possibly the single best hero release that Overwatch 2 has had so far. I have been excited for this character ever since November when we first got a sneak peek at them, and I think that's for good reason. I already knew what a success this character was going to be just looking at their kit without even needing many details. And sure enough, overall the character seems to be receiving very positive reception. And to explain why I've seen this coming for so long, I'll have to explain a little bit about what I think actually makes good character design in Overwatch. You see, when it comes to the characters that are the most fan-favourite, beloved options in the game, you'll see that the vast majority of them follow a very noticeable pattern, where just about every single widely beloved fan-favourite character is not necessarily a character with the most damage output, or the most health. Usually their base stats are actually pretty unimpressive. Think Lucio, think Genji, think Winston. These characters can deal damage, but they don't do a whole lot of damage, honestly. Their damage output is pretty unimpressive. And for the most part, so is their health bars. I mean, Winston's got a little bit more health, but I mean, he's a tank, you kind of expect him to. And with how enormous of a target he is, he loses that health bar faster than a normal character would. These characters don't just have big stats. These characters, though, still aren't bad. In fact, most of them are actually some of the best characters in the game at high-level play, provided you have the skill to play them correctly. Even Winston, who consistently performs poorly in ranked, is almost always the best character in the game in high-level coordinated play. Hell, there have been times at which Winston's win rate on the Grandmaster rank ladder has been around 40%, and yet still he has been the single most popular and effective tank at Overwatch League level play where people play more coordinated. And the reason for this is because what these characters trade away for the fact that they don't get the best stats is that these characters instead get to have more opportunities to do something. Now, in fairness, when I say that, I mostly just mean mobility. But it doesn't necessarily have to be mobility, and that's where Venture comes in. Because while Venture has more mobility than your average character, they don't have Tracer levels of mobility, they don't have Genji levels of mobility. They have mobility, but not an insane amount. And yet still, they're able to do a lot and essentially act as a dive character, thanks to the fact that Burrow allows them to put themselves in spots that no other character in the game could get away with being without them getting eviscerated. The only character who even comes close is Sombra with stealth, but even with stealth, if someone's standing close to you, you get unstealthed, whereas with Burrow, if someone's standing close to you, they still can't hurt you until you pop out of the ground. Put simply, Venture is a well-designed and beloved character, because the reason why Venture is strong isn't a dumb, pure numbers reason. It's not like Mauga, where the reason why Mauga's strong is if he's allowed to sit in front of the enemy tank and hold left click and right click, he gets infinite damage, infinite ult charge, infinite self-heal, and wins the game for free. The worst part about this is that doesn't even necessarily, though sometimes it still does, make Mauga overpowered or anything. In a lot of metas, Mauga isn't exactly the best tank in the game, it's just he's the easy pick. And there's a 50-50 shot you get a free win for picking Mauga regardless of your own skill, even if technically isn't the best pick, just because that requires the enemy tank to play near perfectly and the enemy tank's teammates to actually, help him out a bit because of how much Mauga just takes the enemy tank out of the game. And so if you find yourself in a game where you're losing and you realize it's because the enemy tank is better than you, but the rest of their team isn't that great, you can simply lock Mauga, and chances are you will win that game now, despite the fact that you were the worst tank. Mauga's not the only example, he's just the most recent. I mean, Bastion, Orisa, there are plenty of characters in this game that get to have ludicrous damage numbers that are clearly unfair, but the justification is, well, the character's got poor mobility and doesn't get many opportunities to do things, so they need to be able to do more when they are allowed to do things. As I say, mobility is the main way that this happens, but sometimes it's just with poor range, poor defense, or extremely long cooldowns that characters rely on to be able to do their job, like Baptiste with Immortality Field. Just generally, this whole principle of characters barely ever being able to interact with the game, but the one moment they can, they're allowed to be unkillable and unstoppable, I think is really, really bad for the game. Because most of the time, it's almost always going to be the bad play. It's almost always, in any decent skill lobby, going to be factually worse to try and play someone like Bastion or Mauga than it is going to be to try and play a higher skill character and actually win fairly. However, if you just find yourself in a lobby where maybe one person is carrying the enemy team, but the rest of the team's kind of dropping the ball, all you have to do is divert your resources to deleting that one person from the game, and, well, there you go. You get to win whether you were the better player or not. And it's especially infuriating considering that means that the best player is the one who has to deal with the most bullshit, and ultimately is almost kind of punished for their skill. This is genuinely why most dive characters seem to be perpetually persecuted and almost a martyr of the community. You know, whole nerf Genji meme. Doomfist's always saying their character's garbage when, okay, in fairness, Doomfist is really good. But there are a lot of things that are annoying you have to deal with on Doomfist. At the end of the day, it kind of sounds mean to say, but it's just true. Dive characters are more high skill than poke or rush characters for the most part. Now obviously there can be exceptions to that, but it is a pretty general truth, especially if you're talking ladder play. I could certainly hear out an argument that if you're talking coordinated like Overwatch League games, maybe Rush is more high skill. I mean, you've all got to be on the same page and you've got to be very careful with your cooldown management and you've got to be predicting things before they can happen. Whereas with Dive, you're a little bit more adaptable and you might be able to react to things as they happen, even if you didn't see them coming. But again, we're mostly talking about ladder play here, and I really feel like in ladder play, it's pretty tough to argue against the idea that Dive is the most high skill comp. Poke is mostly just setting up an enormous bunker, getting free value from a range at which your opponent can't do anything about it, or shielding off anything they could do about it with someone like Sigma. And anytime they try and jump your back line, you melt them with a Bastion, or I don't know, maybe a tank's Orisa and just spears them in the face and you're dead before you're even out of stun. Rush is a little bit more skill testing, but even then, for the most part, a lot of Rush is kind of just everyone clump up in a big ball of 5 with a Lucio speeding you in and hold W. Whereas Dive is the one composition where even if you're playing at ladder with no communications with your other teammates, there's still an extremely high level of skill involved. You have to know when to apply pressure on which targets at which times, as well as knowing when to get in and when to get out, as well as knowing how to even get out from each individual situation, given the assumption that you're probably going to have to do it alone if you've got no communication. So on top of all that, you generally want to try and pick engagement times where you have an idea that maybe your tank or your other DPS is going to have more of an opportunity to follow up on what you do, even if there's no guarantee whether they will or won't. Or just generally, even if no one's following up on the targets that you're pressuring, at the very least you should try and pressure at them at times at which that might actually help other people in different fights in different parts of the map win those fights. For example, if you're a Sombra and you're trying to dive the backline and you're trying to get a kill on the supports, but you just can't, they're always looking at each other, they're always healing each other. At the very least, what you can do is, if you see a moment at which everyone's got a chance to shoot the enemy tank, but they won't die because they're getting healed, you can jump one of the supports. And probably you won't kill them, because probably what will happen is that support will start fighting back and pressing all their buttons to stay alive, and the other support next to them will pump them full of healing so you can't kill them. But at the very least, that means that now both supports are using all of their abilities and resources purely to stop you from killing them, meanwhile leaving their tank for dead as they get focused by the rest of your team because they don't have any buttons left to save them. Like if you've got an Ana Lifeweaver with an Orisa as their tank, there's a good chance that if that Orisa gets naded or gets life gripped, if they were about to die, they get bailed out and now they live for certain. However, if the Ana uses nade on herself to not die to you, and the Lifeweaver uses life grip to bail the Ana out as well, now they don't have nade or life grip for the Orisa and they just die. There's all these kind of things that you've got to be aware of when playing dive, even if you're playing with no communication. And that's all without even talking about the basic mechanics that you need to have to be able to take these duels and get out when needed. Now, because of the fact that most dive characters have low kill potential, but lots of opportunities to strike at just the right time and place, that means that there's a good reason why they're consistently some of the most well-beloved characters in the game. Because it's undeniable that they take more skill than most of the rest of the cast, but not only that, but on top of that, they're pretty fair as a result. I mean, a Tracer can't just come out of nowhere and insta-kill you. They can show up very suddenly, but they have to come from some direction that anyone really could have come from, they just couldn't have arrived as fast as Tracer could. And unless you get one clipped, which even then is pretty rare, you're not going to be dying like instantly to a Tracer. You're going to have time to react, and if you died, it's probably going to be your fault. Genji is of course the same. Genji, unless he gets like a dash into you, snaps his neck around 180 degrees, instant triple shurikens you to the head, and then quick melees, unless they do that, they can't insta-kill you out of nowhere. And there's not many Genjis that consistently pull that off. Really, the only dive character that anyone argues is unfair is Sombra, but I honestly pretty heavily disagree with that. I think that's kind of coat. I feel like people still pretend like Hack is a super unfair ability, like it's the same as it was in Overwatch 1, while ignoring the fact that no one ever fucking dies to Hack anymore except Doomfist and Ball. If you play Doomfist or Ball, I can understand if you don't like Hack. If you play anyone else, I will say, unironically, skill issue. You know there's a Sombra on the enemy team. Why the hell are you ever putting yourself in a position where literally not even 1.5 seconds of being able to use your abilities? That's just too much. You're just dead because you can't press a button for 1.5 seconds. Not to mention how many ways there are to cancel Hack. You can shoot the Sombra, you can get out of their line of sight, you can run too far away for the Hack to reach, especially if you're playing Doomfist or Ball, by the way, that works very well against Sombra. Really, the only thing that's even slightly unfair is, of course, infinite invisibility. Something that I'm not necessarily a big fan of, but I also think sometimes gets overblown. Considering how wide the range to be revealed is now with Sombra ever since her last rework, I would say that for the most part, if you get caught by a Sombra that came out of Invis, it's kind of on you. Sombra's got a very slow time to kill compared to other DPS. She never gets to kill anyone before the Hack has worn off unless they just stand still and take the hits. And if you're playing against a Sombra, you know that a Sombra can uninvis at almost any location unless it's narrow and there's no way she can walk in there without being revealed. So all you gotta do is play close to walls. Seriously, most of the time I see people complaining about how unfair Sombra is, a lot of the time they're literally just standing out in the open, nowhere near any cover, and then a Sombra appears and kills them and they're like, what? Why did I die when I'm standing alone in the middle of nowhere with no cover? How did that happen? SMH, nerf Sombra, guys. But yeah, anyway, made a pretty good argument for why I think generally the dive characters are extremely high skill, extremely fun, extremely fair characters in this game. And really the only characters that anyone would argue are exceptions I can imagine are Doomfist and Sombra, and even then, for those two characters it's pretty consistent the reasoning why, it's just because they have CC. Sombra with Hack and Doomfist with his stun from his punch. When it comes to Genji, Tracer, Lucio, Winston, everyone loves these characters. And that brings us all the way back around to Venture.
What? What the fuck?
To describe Venture in as few words as possible, I would say they're probably like a mix between DPS Doomfist and current Sombra. The way that you pick and choose engagements and the angles you tend to attack from are reminiscent of Sombra, whereas the way in which you actually fight once you're in those battles are a lot like DPS Doomfist, where you're very reliant on your cooldown usage and you really want to get up close and get in melee range. Most people, in fact, notice the DPS Doomfist parallels, or not so many the Sombra ones from what I've seen, but I really do think the character plays very similarly to Sombra. But I will say, I would not be surprised if one of the main motivations behind making Venture was to essentially make them a character that would satisfy the DPS Doomfist mains who didn't like Tank Fist. Either way, I've gone this long without explaining what they do, because most people already know when they watch videos like this, but I know that I have a few people who like to watch my videos just to casually check in on Overwatch, but don't play it themselves, and for those people, they probably haven't heard yet, so let me explain. Venture is actually the first hero in a long time to only have 2 abilities rather than 3, though in fairness they do also have 2 passive abilities. Let's start with her primary fire, which honestly I feel like a lot of people are neglecting to mention how weak it is. But that's not a bad thing, because overall the consensus has been that Venture is overpowered. And while I do think that 90% of that is just your typical, like, new hero comes out, everyone cries it's overpowered regardless of how meh they might end up being, I really still maintain that Illari was at worst slightly overtuned on launch, and people really exaggerated how OP Illari was. But either way, I admit I probably would agree that I wouldn't be surprised if what we see before Venture's official release is a small amount of nerfs. From what I've played so far, it seems like generally they overperform, but only by a small margin. Almost every game I get into, if the Venture has any idea how to play the character, then they are going to be the one on the top of the scoreboard, but in fairness, their stats are usually only the best by a few numbers, and they aren't miles ahead of everyone else. But either way, I just wanted to mention that I do feel like people neglect to mention how weak this primary fire is for a DPS. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, the character is really strong in other aspects, so it makes sense for their primary fire to be this weak. I just want to point it out for the people who are saying like, man, this character's so broken, this is so unfair that they can do all this stuff. Like, you gotta remember just how little this character just tickles you when they actually get up close, unless they use their abilities. Because their primary fire only does about 85 damage from what I can tell per shot, and that is if it's a direct hit with a projectile that doesn't travel very far, explodes on its own after only a short distance, so you can't even shoot people that are far away. Although it does explode, the AoE damage is almost non-existent. The highest AoE damage I've gotten that wasn't a direct hit was like 15 or something. It seems like it basically doesn't do anything unless you direct hit. And all that on top of a weapon that doesn't shoot super fast, only has 8 shots in a clip, and when you need to reload, it's a 1.5 second reload, which might sound pretty normal, and it's not that crazy. It's just, in Overwatch, most people in the game have really fast reloads because of how fast-paced the game is. And so, compared to other Overwatch characters, Venture's reload feels a little bit long. I'm not saying it needs to be reduced, I'm just saying it feels longer than the other characters. So overall, their weapon's pretty garbage, but that's because the rest of their abilities very much aren't. The ability that they're known for, though, is Burrow, where they are able to dig into the ground and become temporarily invincible. You can basically walk around anywhere you want like this, just obviously being unable to jump, but for the most part you'll move around like normal and go right through people. If you decide to walk off the ground, you're allowed to do that, but you'll temporarily pop back into existence and be damageable again while you aren't underneath the ground. However, you also can't be healed while you're underground, so you can use that strategically to pop back out of the ground while falling to get some healing, and then land back in the ground at a lower position to go back to not being able to be shot. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was 5 seconds you get under the ground at maximum, and then after 5 seconds you're forced to come out. When you come out, whether it be by pressing the ability button again, pressing jump, or pressing shoot, you can charge up your jump out, or you can just do it immediately. When you pop out, there's an AoE around you which does 55 damage at maximum in the center, and only half as much on the outer ring. You can charge this up if you want to, so the maximum damage you can do with Burrow when you pop out is 110 if someone is dead center when you jump out and you fully charged it. I'll admit, one of the biggest mistakes I made when being new to this character is at first I thought the damage from Burrow was really small, so I basically never charged it up, because I thought, what's the point? I thought it was kind of like Doomfist's Meteor Strike, where it did a lot right in the center, but anywhere on the edges it was practically useless. And so, considering the fact that anyone could easily walk out of the center before the charge would finish, I basically never bothered charging it and just jumped out immediately. Now, in fairness, it is absolutely true that even if the character has 0 mobility, even if you just walk right up to an Ana with Burrow and start charging it, they're going to walk up to the outer ring before you can fully charge it, and that means that they're going to take reduced damage. However, I have realized that charging it is usually worthwhile because of the fact that when it's fully charged, the outer ring at minimum does 55 damage. So the minimum with a fully charged Burrow is the same as a maximum with an uncharged one. And usually the AoE is large enough that even if they try to run away, they will at least get caught by the minimum damage sort of threshold. So actually Burrow does feel pretty impactful because it does feel like once you pop out, you're getting a guaranteed minimum of 55 free damage on them. That is, if you actually want to pop out on top of them. When you pop out, you also go pretty high, but not necessarily high enough to get on top of a building if it's particularly tall. But certainly smaller ledges like the areas in Junkertown, you'll be able to get up there by jumping out of a burrow. And yeah, I'm a huge fan of this ability, because it allows you to engage enemies in positions and places that no other character in the game ever could. The only other character that comes close is Sombra with Stealth, can kind of go anywhere she wants and attack from any angle, just like Venture can with Burrow, but even Sombra has a difference there. With Sombra, if all the enemies clump in one room, she can't attack from whatever angle she wants in that room, because if she gets too close to them, she's going to be revealed, and if it's a close quarters area filled with enemies, she's going to get found. And if she gets found, she's going to die. Whereas Venture can burrow right in there, and if they refuse to budge from that room and they all clump in that room, that means you get 5 people with your burrow damage when you pop out. Now, in fairness, that does also put you in more damage, but if your team's there to follow up or give you some help, maybe you get a Zarya bubble, maybe your Diva runs in and defense matrixes, maybe you just get a life grip. Whatever happens, that'll be a lot of free damage, and maybe the enemies will die for not splitting that. So yeah, certainly if you do that alone, probably going to end pretty badly. But then, of course, the character's not complete without their other ability, Drill Dash, which is essentially Genji Dash, but with a drill instead of a sword. Doesn't go quite as fast, but still goes pretty fast. It goes pretty far as well. Like, I was expecting you'd be able to use it upwards to get onto buildings, but I didn't think it'd go very high, but it actually goes very high. You can get onto some very tall places with this. It goes any direction you want, no penalty at all. As well as that, there is a multi-hit to this move, although the multi-hits are extremely weak. For the most part, the second that you touch them, you're going to do a whole bunch of damage, and any more damage you do from there is going to be tiny little extra bits. And also, you can use the dash underground, although it changes its behavior. For the upsides, it makes it go further, only have a 4-second cooldown instead of an 8-second cooldown, and also makes it so you can steer the dash as it's going on, rather than it having to go in a single direction. On the downsides though, you don't have any initial hit damage on this, it only does the tiny chip damage. It does still do the knockback, but you can't aim it up or down, because obviously you're in the ground. And overall, it pops them upwards as well as away, which means you usually don't get multiple hits with the dash when you use it like this. However, for pure mobility or just putting enemies in a different position, it's a very safe way to do it that gets your next dash back faster. I also neglected to mention that Burrow also has an 8-second cooldown, so both your abilities have an 8-second cooldown, and Drill Dash only has a 4-second cooldown if you use it underground. This means that when you go to engage someone as Venture, often the combo is that you start a Burrow, you dash at them with the Burrow, you try and stall underground as much as you can, you fully charge up so it takes longer for you to pop out of the ground, and then when you pop out, you probably only got half a second left until you got your next drill dash, so you can pop out, shoot, dash at someone, shoot again, then melee them to finish them off. That's like your textbook, like, assuming nothing else has gone wrong and nothing else is happening, that's how you're going to engage a lot of the time as Venture. Especially because of the fact that they have a passive, where they get 40 overhealth every single time they activate an ability. Any ability that they have. Now in fairness, it has a bit of a weird quirk where the maximum overhealth that you can have is 325. And I say that's a little bit weird because while every other character has something like that, 325 is just a weird number for Venture because they get 40 overhealth for using an ability, and 325 is 75 more. So if you ever use both your abilities in a row, you're almost always going to lose 5 of that overhealth. It just seems a little weird because literally if you just increased it by 5, then it wouldn't matter. Though maybe it's intentional. Is when you go for your typical engagement as Venture, where you do the combo I mentioned of Burrow, dash, pop out, hit, dash, hit, melee, you're going to have a total of 365 HP on Venture when you go for one of these engagements. Because you'll arrive with 325 from using both Burrow and dash, and you'll get an extra 40 mid-fight by using your second dash. As you can imagine as well, this is where their second passive comes in. Their melee is stronger than a normal melee, considering they have, a literal drill as a weapon. Although it does have some hidden downsides, although obviously it is still stronger than your average melee. Quick melees in Overwatch always used to do 30 damage, but when they increased the HP of everyone in Season 9, they upped that to 40 damage to help keep in line with everyone's increased HP. Venture's melee is a multi-hit that initially does the normal 40 damage that everyone else does, but then has a bunch of extra little hits afterwards that total up to an extra 30 damage for 70 in total. Now where the downside comes in is because of the fact that Venture's melee is a multi-hit, there are 2 downsides to it. One of them is that it has a longer animation, which means that it takes longer to spam melee on this character than on other characters. And the other downside is that normal melees have this weird thing with their hitboxes, where because someone leaves their fist out for so long in most of these animations, even if you punch thin air, but then turn around to the person you meant to hit, so long as they haven't pulled their fist back, it will still count as a hit on most characters. Whereas for Venture, if the multi-hit has started, you will lose that initial 40 damage and instead only get the tiny 30 damage afterwards. So make sure as Venture that you don't have to correct yourself and turn around once you've already started the melee to actually hit the character you're going for. You have to make sure you're already facing the character you want to hit with your drill before you press the hit button. Because if you press it too early, you won't be able to correct yourself by turning it around without losing a whole bunch of damage, which might not be the case on other characters in the game where you can quickly turn around and correct your mistake. Lastly, there's the ultimate, which I kind of already forgot the name of. But either way, people have just been memeing about how it's Earthshatter but good. This ultimate can only be used on the ground, but essentially, you have a few seconds in which you get 4 shots of the ultimate. When you hit your ultimate button, you'll instantly be set to the max overhealth of 75, so you'll have 325 HP in total. And you'll get 4 shots of this sort of earthquake that goes in a cone. When it hits someone, it pops them into the air like a wrecking ball pile drive, and they have a bit of movement lockout. It deals 125 damage per hit, so if they get no healing while the ult is going, this can 2-tap most of the characters in the game. Also, this is a little bit inconsistent, but it can sometimes go right through cover. I haven't quite figured out exactly how this works yet, but from what I can tell, if it's something like a box on the ground, it's not like attached to the ground, it is just something that is placed on the ground that is a small item that gives cover, it seems that the earthquake goes right through it and hits people hiding behind it. Whereas if it's actually a wall of a building, it will block the earthquake and won't hit people on the other side. Similarly, I got a bit confused because sometimes I was able to hit people through their shields with this ability and sometimes I wasn't, and I couldn't figure out the rule. And I think what happened was, essentially, sometimes there is a tiny gap between the shield and the ground. Sometimes you'll be able to hit a Reinhardt right through that shield with this ult if they're looking even just a little bit upwards. However, if they make sure to keep their shield to the ground, then they'll be able to block it. Also, be careful with this ultimate, because if you use it like on a staircase, even if it's only a tiny drop, if you fire the cone in a direction where it has to drop down to continue the earthquake, then it'll just stop as soon as it can't go straight anymore. A lot of people have been saying this ultimate is the most OP part of Venture's kit, and I think it's a teensy bit overblown because of the fact that you gotta remember it's only 125 damage per shot. That's actually not a lot for an ultimate. Most ultimates do more than that. However, I do acknowledge that the reason it's so effective is once again not necessarily having bigger numbers, but having better opportunities. This ultimate is very hard to counteract. You're fully in control of Venture as you're using it, so it doesn't lock you in place like something like Pharah's Rocket Barrage, even though that technically does more damage. It gives you instant health to give you an increased chance of surviving. It gives you a good amount of time to use the ult. It gives you 4 shots, so if one shot misses, it's not the end of the world. And these shots sometimes go through cover, have a wide AoE, and are practically unavoidable on some characters. I think that's the main reason why the ult feels really strong, is that despite the fact it honestly doesn't do a lot of damage for an ultimate, only 500 at maximum over the course of 4 shots. Technically, that's not a whole lot more than a Tracer Pulse Bomb, but obviously a Pulse Bomb's a lot harder to connect than this ultimate, which is very easy to connect and often very hard to escape. It seems like generally, unless the Venture gets hit by a sleep dart or killed instantly, this ult is pretty hard to avoid or counter. Even if you hit them with like a spear or a rock, the ult lasts long enough that you don't really tend to cancel it with that. It doesn't end the ultimate if you get stunned during it. It just means you have less time to use it, but you still have time to use it. So with all that said, that is Venture's kit. Now it's time for me to explain myself. Why do I say that Adventure is dive for dummies, and why do I think this is really, really good? Well, you see, as I mentioned earlier, dive takes a lot of skill. As fun as it is, and as fair as it is, and as healthy as it is for the game in most cases, at the end of the day, it's also very, very, very punishing to play into and as. And what that unfortunately means is that it's got a very rough learning curve. When we look at the main dive DPS characters in the game right now, we're looking at Tracer, Genji, and Sombra. There are some other dive DPS, but a lot of the other ones are kind of on the fringes. Like, is Echo a dive DPS? Sort of yes, sort of no. Is Reaper dive? Kind of? Hell, I even think you can make a decent argument that Sojourn is sort of dive. But it's pretty clear to see that these 3 characters don't quite go into the exact same category as Tracer, Sombra, and Genji. And when we look at these 3 pure dive characters, you might notice that all 3 of them are characters that in your average bronze or silver lobby, if you see someone on them, it's a warning sign. Your average bronze Genji spends the whole game double jumping about the place, throwing triple shurikens from 50 miles away, and feeding his ass off. Your average low rank Tracer is probably going to have 50 deaths by the end of the game and 2 elims. And your average low rank Sombra is sitting invisible in the enemy's backline, constantly hacking random people that don't even have an important ability to shut down, while there's no one around to capitalize on their hacks, expecting their teammates to do something. Meanwhile, spending an entire game having contributed truly nothing to their team, but hey, I guess at least they haven't died. Now don't get me wrong, part of this is just stereotypes about low ranks in general, but it's certainly not a hard sell to most people that yeah, these characters in particular, if someone bombs on them because they're bad at the game, it's not just going to be they're going to underperform. It's not just going to be they're going to die a couple more times than maybe they needed to. They are well and truly going to be the enemy team's 6th player, giving them free ult charge while contributing little to nothing to your team. And that makes them really unwelcoming to new players who really don't want to be that guy. A lot of new players really just want to get through a game, try and learn something from it, try and have some fun, and try not to think, oh shit, I really hope I didn't throw that game for my team. And so when it comes to these make or break characters where you select them and if you don't perform, you are going to feed.
Mrs. Obama, get down!
Yeah, it's pretty scary if you're a newer player. And at the end of the day, I do think this is a big problem, because as much as we'd like to sit here and be like, well, get good, scrubs, just fucking learn how to play the difficult characters. I mean, if you're just bad at the game, then I don't care. If you want to take that angle, sure, maybe you got a point there, but at the same time, how the hell is anyone ever going to get good if the only characters they feel like they're allowed to play without getting flamed are Orisa and Mauga? And I guess this is what I was worried about, that dive is the source of a lot of the game's fun, but it seems that a lot of people don't necessarily understand that, though they kind of get a vibe for it. And a lot of people feel very disincentivized to play dive. In fact, this might be a better way to put it. It's not necessarily that people don't understand that dive is what makes this game fun and fair a lot of the time. I think that people generally go along with that, but a lot of people don't realize how many of the troubles that dive has are just a skill issue, and how many of them are the game being unfair. Because I'm not going to say that it's completely fair for you right now if you want to go and play Winston or Doomfist or whatever. I'm not going to say that there aren't some things you'll have to deal with which will kind of be bullshit and it is the game being unfair. But for the most part, I feel like people like to pretend that, man, dive used to be fun and fair and not shit, and I didn't used to get destroyed by all these abilities, and now there's all these things in the game that just destroy me for free whenever I try and play Genji in my silver lobbies. Man, this game's garbage. But to be honest, I'm not gonna lie, I do think a lot of it is a skill issue. Again, kind of like I've said before in a lot of my tank videos, I think it's sort of a situation where, yes, it is true that there are some bullshit you're gonna have to put up with, where it feels like you have to do so much just to do the bare minimum. And yes, it is true that sometimes it really will be unfair, and you will have to do more than you really should just to perform. But at the end of the day, you are playing a dive character. You will provide more value to your team than any other character in the game if you can perform. There is a reason that you're fighting such an uphill battle. You volunteered for an uphill battle by picking a high skill character. And so I've got this constant dilemma where part of me wants to say, well, people just have to get good, but part of me also wants to say, well, let's be real, people maybe should just get good, but at the same time, just telling them that isn't going to make them suddenly enjoy having to put up with all the bullshit they have to put up with to be able to play dive effectively. And I look at Venture as a great gateway to a lot of people to understand how to play dive. Not even necessarily because they're a dumb character. That's mostly just thumbnail material. If I had to guess from what I've played so far, I would honestly consider Venture to probably be a medium to high skill character. But the reason why I can say that both this character seems medium to high skill to me, but also I think this character is going to be a great entry point to dive for a lot of newer players, is because of the fact that their Burrow ability feels like a great way to lower the entry cost for dive. Now, don't get me wrong, I definitely think if you're not particularly skilled at the game and you start playing Venture, you probably won't contribute a whole lot to the team. You probably would be getting more done if you just played Soldier and held left click on a tank, or if you just, I don't know, played Junkrat and threw bombs everywhere. But critically, unlike playing Tracer or Genji, I don't think a bad Venture would just feed and die non-stop. I think a bad Venture would get into fights relatively often where they can't really get much done, and then they would press Burrow and get out. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do great as a result, but it at least means they won't bomb and embarrass themselves and be subject to constant flame from their team. Essentially what I'm saying is, while the skill ceiling of Venture is still going to be very high, the skill floor is going to be a little bit more entry level. Not to mention that while I can't be sure, I also expect that the counterplay to Venture is going to be very poor at lower ranks, which means that you might be able to get away with more as Venture at lower ranks than you would be at higher ranks, even if you don't necessarily have the best skills on the character. Essentially, I have high hopes that this character can sort of bridge the gap between the hardcore players and the casual players, being a character that makes both of them happy. I mean, I mentioned it in previous videos, but I think it's always been true that even newer players don't really like low-skill characters. I mean, do bronze players like Moira? Do bronze players like Bastion? Do they like Orisa? No, ironically, these characters that are made for beginners are typically the ones that beginners hate the most, because the very fact they are so easy to abuse and they take skill to counter means that low skill ranks there is no way to counter them, because no one has the skill to do it. And so, counterintuitively, the most beginner-friendly characters become the characters that beginners hate the most. Because the only way you can make a low-skill character balanced in a competitive game is to make them extremely powerful when they're not being countered, but to make countering them takes skill, which of course inevitably means they will always dominate the lower ranks. Venture, I feel like, could do a great job of sort of evening out the results. I can see Venture doing decent in Bronze, I can see Venture doing decent in Plat, I can see Venture doing decent in Grandmaster. I could be completely off, but I really feel like this character could feel fun and welcoming for literally every skill level in this game. And so I guess that's why they make me so hopeful for the future of this game. My one issue with the character is this is the first release in a long time to only have 2 abilities, not even an alt fire. You might not have noticed this, but genuinely, if I ask you right now, can you name any character left in Overwatch that doesn't have an alt fire that only has 2 abilities? Now there are some, but there are not many. There's of course the sniper characters, Ashe, Widow, and Ana, because their right click is just aiming down their scope. Reaper doesn't have an alt fire, Bastion doesn't have an alt fire, and technically Junkrat doesn't. I mean, his right click is detonating a mine, which is technically something, but in fairness, that's kind of part of the mine ability, so I could hear a fair argument to say that doesn't count. So what, 3 characters in the entire game left that don't have an alt fire if you don't count the snipers? And you might notice that all of these characters I've listed generally feel very one note, and that sometimes they struggle to adapt to situations as they change because they're only really good at one thing. Reaper's really good at close combat and really good at farming the tank, but I mean, if he's caught out in a situation where he just simply isn't allowed to do that, he's basically got nothing to contribute to the game. Junkrat's got some enormous damage output, but unless you can pull off an amazing flank rat, there's not a whole lot else to him. Especially considering the Season 9 changes makes it harder to play flank rat, when already playing flank rat is like 10 times harder than playing normal Junkrat. And Bastion, well, let's be real, Bastion just farms the tank. That's what he does. Certainly in Overwatch 2, Bastion became a little bit more bearable, but he still exists as a character that basically just deletes the tank from the game and doesn't really do much else. There's a pretty consistent theme here where when characters have only 2 abilities, they tend to be pretty one note, pretty boring, pretty low skill, and just generally not super fun. Hell, even Torbjorn. Technically Torbjorn does have an alt fire, so technically he doesn't count, but I don't know. Torbjorn's alt fire, I mean, it's not bad necessarily, it's just not that useful. And considering that, you know, aside from that, he just has Overlord and Turret, I kind of want to throw Torbjorn in that bucket too. There is only one character I've left out of this list, and that is technically Tracer, only has 2 buttons. And in fairness, in Tracer's case, it kind of works. I personally would like to see Tracer get a 3rd button. I know that most people probably don't care, but I do feel like while Tracer generally can adapt to situations well thanks to her mobility, sometimes it does feel like you're just on a map where there's no way to get close, and it's like, damn, I wish I could at least do something from this distance, but I also get that it makes sense for Tracer to not be great at long range. Overall, though, I can't deny, Tracer is certainly pretty high skill, fun, and adaptable despite her limitations even with 2 abilities. So I guess it's possible, yeah, that you can have characters with 2 abilities and that's fine. The thing is that I think there's a distinction. With Tracer it works because blinks, you get 3 of them and they can be used in many different ways. They can be used as survival tools to dodge shots, they can be used as mobility tools to get to where you need to go, they can be used as ways to reach high ground, and so as a result you can usually adapt to circumstances using Blink so that you don't necessarily need that 3rd ability. Whereas with Reaper, obviously Wraith Form and Teleport help, but they don't really give you everything you need to be able to adapt to everything that comes your way. So Venture having only 2 abilities is fine if the same goes for them. If Drill, Dash, and Burrow is really all they need to be able to adapt to any circumstance that faces them. And I think it's almost there, but I guess I'm just a little disappointed. Especially considering some of the moves we saw in the trailer, it really made it look like you were going to have more options with these 2 abilities than you actually do. I essentially was hoping that these may only be 2 abilities, but they're 2 abilities that have a lot of, you know, case-sensitive applications where they behave slightly differently. Like initially, before I got to play it myself, I was expecting that Drill Dash would behave differently depending on whether you activated it on the ground or mid-air, before I realized that it would go in any direction wherever you used it. Now in fairness, there is some of that in the fact that I mentioned that using Drill Dash underground does have a special interaction where it behaves differently and has a shorter cooldown. That is really good, by the way, that's one of the best parts of Venture's kit. I'm just a little disappointed that's the only thing. Like, we don't have maybe Drill Dash doing bonus damage, you use it downwards because then you're not fighting against gravity. And I mean, there's less situations where Drill Dashing downwards is helpful compared to upwards anyway, so to me it would make sense that doing it downwards would do increased damage to compensate. As well as that, there are 3 buttons to cancel a Burrow and they all do the exact same thing. What's up with that? You can cancel a Burrow by pressing the Burrow button again, by pressing jump, or by pressing shoot. All 3 of those work. And that's not a bad thing, I'm just disappointed they all do the exact same thing with no difference. I would have liked to seen a bit more adaptability, where for example, if you unburrow by pressing burrow again, then you instantly pop out with absolutely 0 animation time, you're instantly actionable, but there's no damage. If you press shoot to pop out, then you can charge it up and deal damage as usual. However, if you press jump to pop out, I would have liked it if they did that little dive thing they do in the trailer, but they actually leap out of the ground and then land somewhere else. But maybe it just doesn't do any damage, but it has a lot more mobility to it. In the trailer, that's kind of a trick. All that really happened there was that Venture used Drill Dash and happened to leave the ground and then re-enter the ground from a lower position. They didn't actually leap out of the ground like it kind of looks like they do. I kind of wish that was actually just, you know, part of their kit, that they could leap out of the ground just by pressing jump to come out of the ground rather than pressing shoot or burrow. And it might seem at first like this is really nitpicky, and don't get me wrong, it is a little bit nitpicky, but I mean, this is really the kind of polish that makes for, like, amazing character design. Like, we have a great base for a character here. There's nothing about Venture's design that I look at and think, ooh, that's problematic. No, everything here, I think, yeah, great design here. Anything I can think of that might be kind of anti-fun is so ludicrously small it barely matters. Like, an example of what I mean is, I kind of would have preferred it if Venture's passive was the same as Doomfist's, where you actually have to hit them with an ability to get the overhealth rather than just when you press the button. Because I kind of don't like, just as a fundamental rule, being able to give people health for free just for pressing buttons rather than having to do something to earn it. But I mean, in fairness, it's not like you were going to miss your burrow or drill dash 90% of the time, so I understand it doesn't really make much of a difference, and at the end of the day, it's not a lot of overhealth, so I don't really think it makes a big deal. And that's like basically all I can think of that might be a problem with Venture. So I do think we got an amazing base to build off of, but that's just the thing. I kind of feel like there's more work that needs to be done here. I feel like we've got an amazing start here, but this really could be a perfect character. We just kind of need to do more. I feel like it feels a little bit restrictive that this character that feels so fun to play and is such a fun basis to work off of ultimately doesn't have a lot of ways to interact with the game. It's kind of just you burrow in and you dash out. And there's not a whole lot of, okay, let me think about the way in which I burrow in or dash out. You know, if we took my suggestion with the different ways you come out of burrow, every single time you go in for an engagement, you're not just burrowing in and then dashing out, you're burrowing in and then you've got to make a decision between 3 different ways you can arrive with burrow, then you dash out. Not to mention, if we applied the same logic to dash, there could also be multiple ways for you to dash out. And then, of course, there's more depth and decision-making going on there. But either way, I really can't complain too much. As I say, I feel like this character is very easy to grasp the basics of, but I really do think there will still be a lot of skill to mastering this character. And I think that's kind of shown by the fact that most people have picked up this character fine, but I have absolutely seen a few people who just pick up this character and go like 2 and 7 on them and swap off. And in fairness, maybe that kind of rebuts what I just said earlier about them being more beginner friendly, but I don't know. As I say, it seems like usually with other dive characters, when someone bombs, they do a lot worse than going 2 and 7. Not to mention, whenever anything like this happens, it brings back a lot of returning players that haven't played in years. And quite frankly, not trying to be mean to you guys, but whenever you guys who clearly haven't played in years come back, we could tell. Whenever something new's added to the game, it will just be, okay, for like a few days, like there's just going to be half the players in these games are going to be clueless. Just because they haven't played in months or years or whatever. One last thing that I really like about Venture as well, which I haven't heard anyone talking about, and maybe this is me just being tank-brained. I mean, even though I play more support, you definitely know that my opinions very much fall into the tank hive mind, I guess. Really, the only place where I disagree with the popular tank opinions for the most part is that, one, I've mentioned before, I think that Doomfist mains, while they have a lot of things that rightfully piss them off, I hate that they pretend their character is weak when Doomfist is amazing. And the other one being that I still think that tank has enormous amounts of carry potential, while it's also true that they are extremely stressful. And sometimes if people try and decide to lock you out of the game, they can lock you out of the game and make it so you're just unable to play if your teammates don't help you. Other than that, yeah, I do tend to hold a lot of popular tank opinions, so maybe it's just that. But I have to say, I really like that Venture isn't just another tank farmer. I mean, how many DPS in this game feel like they exist just to farm tank? I mean, in fairness, it's a little bit rough because the very concept of weapon spread farms tank. So, anyone who has weapon spread is going to be more effective against a tank than a squishy. And that's really, really shit already because, I mean, 90% of the roster has weapon spread. So, naturally they are going to do more damage to big targets than small targets. But I really like how with Venture we have this character that has to get within the effective range of tanks to be able to fight them, so they can't just farm them safely from the other side of the map where the tank can't do anything to them. But also when they get close to them, doesn't just get a free kill on them because they get to do ludicrous damage up close when they're point blank, like a Junkrat or a Bastion maybe would be able to. Venture really feels like they're in this sweet spot where the way they actually engage with tanks feels like the way that everyone should have to engage with tanks, where often they can only be effective within the tank's range, so they can't really just farm the tank for free from a safe distance. And once they're in their range, they're in trouble a bit. They gotta be careful about how they go about fighting a tank. But they still do enough damage to kill the tank if the tank is stupid. It's just that they won't be able to burst kill them suddenly out of nowhere with no preparation, no indication, no time for the tank to get out. I don't know, I've just really appreciated that. Even as the Venture having to deal with other tanks, there's only a couple examples where it felt kind of unfair. I've really liked how it doesn't feel like I can just sit there and farm tanks. It feels like when I see a tank, I have to be careful about them. It feels like when I die to a tank, usually it does feel earned. It feels like, yeah, no, that was a misplay from me, tank outsmarted me. And when I get a kill on the tank, I feel like I got it because I outsmarted them, rather than because I'm simply playing a character that gets to farm them for free. And I know this sounds really small, but I just really feel like it's been a long time since I played a DPS that feels like they have fair fights with tanks. The only exception really is when you get a real heal sponge tank like Orisa, who just runs at Venture. Yeah, Venture kind of can't do shit about that. But then Venture can do a lot to kill the supports that are healing that tank, so kind of evens out. So overall, yeah, I think Venture is a wonderful addition to this game, and we really need more characters like Venture in the game. I'm not gonna lie, I was starting to get a little worried by the time Malga came out about maybe them losing their knack with newer hero designs. Tanks like Ramatra and Junker Queen really got my hopes up because I think they're some of the most fun and fair tanks ever added to this game, when even some of the classics that most people like, I honestly don't think Reinhardt is completely fair. I think usually the deck is stacked against him, which is why we usually stick up for him, and of course we have a nostalgic place in our hearts for Reinhardt. But I also think the few times that Reinhardt does get the upper hand, it often swings too hard in the other direction, where while it's very easy to counter Reinhardt, if you don't choose things that shut him down, he kind of just gets to hold W and get free kills regardless of the other player's skill. Either way, I was getting kind of worried, because when I looked at the hero releases, I'm like, okay, so we had Sojourn, balance-wise a bit rough, but I guess design-wise I'm fine with Sojourn. We had Junker Queen, oh yeah, Junker Queen was great, and then we had Kiriko. Well, yeah, I've already made a whole video on Kiriko. I think she's the worst designed character ever added to Overwatch. Although thankfully I feel like she's been nowhere near as much of a pain in the ass in Season 9. Then came Lifeweaver, a character I got very excited for because Life Grip and Petal Platform are some of my favourite abilities ever added to the game, but unfortunately the character as a whole kind of came out a mess that now just becomes a stat stick that doesn't really do anything to help his team for the most part, except just make them unkillable until he dies, without really having any way to be proactive himself, only being able to fix problems once they're already presented in front of him. Then came Alari, and while I haven't heard many people crowing about Alari, I'm not a fan of her. I think her design is very boring, and I feel like she's unfortunately a character that is just a slave to whatever meta she's in. Don't get me wrong, there are always characters that are weaker or stronger in certain metas, but I really feel like with Alari, if it's poke, she's a free win. If it's not poke, she's garbage. I think she's that binary. It feels like every time I play Alari, it's just unlosable if we get to play a poke team and they can't play dive into us. But the second dive is good, it really feels like you can't make Alari work. Even if you do well on Alari, even if you kill a whole bunch of enemies and keep yourself alive, you're not going to be healing people if you're constantly going to be having to deal with people diving you as Alari, and you're not going to be able to keep your healing pile alive, and so as a result, yeah, you're going to be playing with 3 DPS, but you're also going to be playing with 1 support, and so you're going to lose. Whereas the second you can actually just put a pylon somewhere where no one will deal with it. Then you pylon next to your second support, and now you're playing with 2 supports, 3 DPS, and a tank, which makes it a 6v5, so now you win. I just really feel like Alaria is just, if you're playing poke and they're not playing dive, you win. If not, you lose. And then, of course, Mauga. We don't even have to get into Mauga. I don't even have to make any arguments about Mauga. Oh boy, Mauga's really making me question whether Kiriko really is the worst character ever added to this game. And so, considering that there was always some promise, but generally a lot of these hero releases were starting to flop, and the main thing that was keeping me around was the fact that I really thought they finally understood how to design tanks because of how good Ramatra and Junker Queen came out, only for them to follow that one up with Mauga? I don't understand how you can make 2 of the most fair and well-rounded tanks in the entire game ever made, and then follow that up with fucking Mauga. Like, what happened there, guys? I'm not gonna lie, Mauga really kind of disheartened me, made me worried that maybe they had lost their touch with hero design, maybe they didn't know how to make good heroes anymore, maybe even the few good qualities of some of the heroes like Lifeweaver were just complete crapshoots where they just looked into some cool abilities, but when you look at the design of the whole hero, it kind of feels like it wasn't intentional. It kind of feels like they don't understand how the few things that work about the character do work and why those things are cool, even if the whole character as a whole is a bit of a mess. Venture really feels refreshing. Venture really feels like the first time in years that I've been able to look at a character and just go, wow, yeah, that's what we want. We want more of that. So with all that said, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.